Painting is an essential part of compositing, but there are many different approaches to paints, all with their pros and cons. In this class, we'll take a closer look at the paint workflow of the Silhouette plugin and how it can be a great addition to your compositing toolkit. I'm Christoph Zapletal for Boris Effects. Let's do some painting. I spend a lot of time in compositing for commercials, so today's example will be straight out of that realm. We have this tasty shot of a burger, but as usual, we can always make this even more yummy. I'll be showing this in Fusion, but if you do your compositing in Flame, After Effects or Nuke, you'll certainly find something useful in here as well. The brief is that we should get rid of some of the grease here on the slice of cheese and close the gaps here on the patty. I could of course do this with the Fusion paint node, but the Silhouette paint workflow offers some very unique benefits. Before I start rattling off all the pros and cons of both approaches, let's just dive in and we'll explore them on the way, shall we? Now let's call up the Silhouette plugin. If you watched the last class, where we explored Silhouette in tandem with Nuke, you'll see that while the look of our properties inside of Fusion is just a tiny little bit different, our options are exactly the same. So, without much further ado, let's open up the Silhouette interface. Once it pops up, Silhouette will ask us what kind of work we want to do. Let's choose Paint as a preset to get everything configured for some nice paint strokes. But this is new. Silhouette will ask us to specify a save location. Wait, what does a plugin need with a save location? Almost everything the Silhouette plugin does is saved as plugin data inside of your host's main project, so in this case, inside of our Fusion composition. But the Paint node is a bit of an outlier in that regard. As each individual paint stroke will be saved and recorded, there's a lot of information to be saved, and to not bloat our Fusion composition, it will be saved in a separate file. But don't worry about it. You only have to set this up once. From now on, the plugin will always refer to this file. Just make sure to keep it with your com script. So specify a location and give it a fitting name. Maybe just the name of your Fusion composition. The file extension for Silhouette files is .sfx, just in case you wondered. The Paint preset gives us not only a Paint node, but also a Roto node. What are we supposed to do with that? Well, the Paint workflow inside of Silhouette relies heavily on you first stabilizing parts of the image with a track and then doing your paint work. It is like a classical stabilized inverse workflow, but with a twist. Bear with me here. Let's start by identifying the first area we want to work on, the patty. Our client wants these two dark spots removed. Okay, so the first step will be to stabilize that part of the image. In the toolbar on the left-hand side of the viewer, I've got a number of shapes at my fingertips. For this, I'm going with a Mocha-style X-spline and draw that roughly around my two dark spots. And then I can switch to the tracker mode of the Roto node. Would you look at that? Now we've got access to classic point tracking, two flavors of planar tracking, and even optical flow stabilization. Neat! I'm a Mocha guy, so I'm gonna stick with that. There's a full-blown Mocha Pro node right inside of Silhouette, but for our purposes, the streamlined interface here will do just fine. Let's leave everything at the defaults and track away. Wait, Christoph, this is supposed to be about painting. Aren't we getting a little bit off track? Easy, we're getting there. Let me first draw your attention here to our objects list. There's our X-spline and a layer atop containing the tracking data we just created. Let's rename that to patty. Now, we are going to move up here. With these controls, I can stabilize the viewer to this track. So I'll click Enable and choose Roto Patty. Now let's play back that clip. That looks pretty locked. Okay, so stabilizing the viewer is great for quality control of our track. But there's more to this. Let's also use this tracking data to stabilize a clone source so that we've got a locked image and our clone strokes don't start wandering off. Let's quickly take a look at our node tree. Notice the data port connection the preset created between the Roto node and the Paint node. Our tracking data is piped to the Paint node, but we can also branch it off into a transform node to stabilize our image to that same tracking data. To have that stabilized image available as a source inside of the Paint node, let's pipe it in here. Let's switch over to the Paint node. This is where stuff gets really interesting. The idea behind Silhouette's paint workflow is that you paint your strokes on a single frame and then record them over the entire range you want to paint on. This is why stabilizing before is so important, because otherwise your paint strokes would be all over the place. So up until here, this sounds like a classical stabilized inverse workflow. But I promised a twist. The tracking data will be applied to the paint stroke before it is committed to the image. That means that, unlike with traditional workflows, there is no transform filtering happening when painting. I'm going to switch the viewer stabilization off. Our burger shot has a very long pullback, so I'm gonna start painting on the last frame of the clip, the one where our burger is arguably the furthest away from the camera and the smallest. With traditional paint workflows, that would be a really bad idea. I'm going to select a clone brush. With Shift pressed down, I can adjust the offset, and with Command on the Mac or Control on the PC, I can change the size of the brush by dragging left or right. Let's also select source 1 so that I can clone from that stabilized source. Before I clone away, I need to tell Silhouette to respect that stabilization we did. The first step is to choose the appropriate transform layer for this group. So Paddy is our option for now, but there will be more options soon. Next, I'm going to check Match Move so that the movement is applied to the strokes. Last but certainly not least, I'm going to select Source Match Move as well, so that my clone source is stable. Otherwise, things might get a little funky. Notice that each brush stroke here appears in the object list tightly grouped together with date and time added. With the playback controls below, I can now record these strokes to all the previous frames. Don't be bothered by the occasional flickering, that's just the GUI updating. Once Silhouette is done, this will be continuous and, as our track was solid, also stable. But let's zoom in really close at the beginning of the clip, where our burger is now largest. Our brush strokes not only held their place, but also scaled correctly with the camera move. And there's no filtering issues. If I use the 1 and 2 keys on my keyboard to switch between the result and the original source, there's no difference in quality, even though I set these strokes up on the frame where the burger is much smaller. That is the key difference to the traditional stabilized inward workflows you might be familiar with. The transformation is applied to the paint stroke, not the image. So our patty is patched up pretty well, but the cheese is not quite up to par yet. Our client wants this to look less greasy, so we need to remove some of these tiny little black spots from the surface. Let's track that cheese. I will name the newly created layer Cheese and use the viewer stabilization to check how my track holds up. And just to be extra clear on this, think of the viewer stabilization like a lookup table. It is merely a viewer adjustment. Let's also bring in another transform node to have some stabilized American cheese to work with. Make sure to select the correct track in the pull-down here. Thankfully, we can pipe quite a lot of additional sources into the paint node. This time, I will start painting at the beginning of the clip. I'll be extra careful to select the correct transform layer and to switch on both the match move and the source match move checkboxes. Let's clone in some cheese. But somehow, this looks splotchy. What would really help now is some frequency separation. It is a really good and proven technique to separate the color from the detail of the image. That way, you can paint on the color and the detail independently and give both elements of your image the best possible treatment. Normally, that would mean setting up a small comp tree with 4 to 5 nodes. And that, in turn, would be quite an interruption of your workflow. Honestly, I think that's the worst part. You're just in the zone, painting away, and suddenly you have to rewire half of your comp tree, and your brain with it. But with Silhouette, frequency separation is just right built into the paint node. First, let's take a look at the different layers we can paint on. By pressing 8 on the keyboard, we can call up the color layer, and by pressing 9, we can see the detail layer. Now this is just a view. Viewing the detail layer doesn't mean that you're also painting on just the detail layer. Think of this like context views. You can view one part of your comp while modifying another part. To actually paint on just the color or the detail layer, you have to select the option down here. If you set this to color, you'll paint on just the color. With detail, yes, you'll just paint on the detail, and with normal, you'll go back to the normal paint mode you know and love. With this value here, you can decide how fine or coarse the frequency separation between color and detail layer should be. But as we can independently control what we see and what we work on, we can press 1 to see the final result but still just paint on either the detail or the color layer. And we can, of course, use all the brushes available to us, from the clone brush we have been using all along to other ones like blur, dodge, burn, or, my flame peeps will just love this, the drag brush. As you can see, I continued this a little bit more and also did some fixes on the seeds and the bun, typical tasks for food commercials, but all done inside the Silhouette Paint node. Now, is this a replacement for the Paint node inside of Fusion or Nuke, Flame, or After Effects for that matter? No, not necessarily, but it can be a huge addition to your toolset, as the paint workflow inside of Silhouette is really different. The way it handles stabilization makes sure it is pretty much lossless, and you will have far less issues with artifacts or sampling. It is definitely a different way to think about paint, so really play around with it and see where it works out for you. In the next class of this series, we are going to take a look at the 3DC node within Silhouette, hosted by Flame this time. I'm Christoph Zapletal for Boris Effects. See you there.